In this session, we will talk about the rebellions against the Grand National Assembly that assembled in Ankara in April 1920. As mentioned, the Istanbul government and the Ottoman Parliament's closure, it created a legitimate background for Ankara and for the Anatolian movement to open a new parliament in the city of Ankara. But as this Grand National Assembly was opened, with the provocation of the Istanbul government, of the Sultan, and also with the help of the victorious powers, especially British and the French, that certain rebellions started to emerge in various parts of Anatolia. There are two important reasons for these rebellions. One of them was, as mentioned, the provocation of the Ottoman Sultan and the Istanbul government with the help of the victorious powers, and the second one was the desire of the Anatolian movement to form a regular army. Now the national forces, which emerged on local basis and acted as militias, who in a sense put the resistance against the invading forces, but when they were called under the command of a regular army, some portions of national forces had resisted and rejected to join the regular army. The main rationale can be explained as the leaders of these groups, who in a sense got used to act as the supreme commander, and in some cases they also exploited the peasants and the local populations through banditry and other various actions. So when the Grand National Assembly were opened and their desire to form the regular army, this was exploited by the Istanbul government and the Sultan, and certain rebellions has started to occur. Now also the Istanbul government had in a sense legitimized these rebellions against the Grand National Assembly by declaring certain fatwas, saying that the Ankara Anatolian movement is acting against the will of the Sultan and the Caliph. And also, as we mentioned before, some of these national forces did not recognize the supreme authority of the Grand National Assembly that the assembly had assumed itself, and the most prominent ones were people like Cherkez Ethem and Ali Yörük Efe, which we will mention later in this session. And of course, Grand National Assembly also took some precautions in order to hamper the emergence or the spreading of these rebellions. First of all was the Mufti of Ankara, the Grand Imam, the greatest religious authority in the city of Ankara, had declared a fatwa which supports the Anatolian movement, and also any communication with Istanbul has been cut, which also facilitated the insertion of the authority of Anatolian movement of the Ankara and also the Grand National Assembly to assert their authority over Anatolia. And also the first law that the Grand National Assembly has codified was the law on treason. So through this law, those rebellious groups were in a sense could be legally punished. And the types of these rebellions can be analyzed in four main groups. The first one is the rebellions that were directly organized and arranged by Istanbul government, and the first one of these were Anzavur rebellion, which took place in the Biga Peninsula, which is in today's Çanakkale. And the second one was that the Ottoman palace, the Istanbul government, have organized an anti-national forces army, which was called Kuvayi İnzibatiye. And in a sense, this Kuvayi İnzibatiye has not fulfilled its duty, or has in a sense suppressed the Anatolian movement, because it was an army that was financed and founded with the will of Sultan, and it also contained some army officers who are loyal to the Istanbul and against the Anatolian movement. But these two rebellions were in a sense failed. And also the second type of the rebellions were the ones who were supported and also financially supported by the victorious powers, and these rebellions can be summarized as the Konya Rebellion, Bolu Rebellion, Bolu Hendek, and Adapazarı Rebellion, and Yozgat Rebellion. Yozgat Rebellion is somehow could be considered as dangerous for the Anatolian movement within this type of rebellions, within the second type of rebellion, because the Yozgat Rebellion constituted the jeopardy for the Anatolian movement because it occurred within Anatolia. And also the other rebellions can be called that certain clans, the local clans rebellion, Afyon Rebellion and Koçgir rebellions. And the third type of the rebellions against the rebels, against the Grand National Assembly, were the ones who at the beginning were dedicated nationalists and formed an important portion of national forces, but as mentioned before, that their reluctance to join the regular army and also the personal passions or the personal ambitions of their leaders had in a sense caused them to rebel against the Ankara government. So the most important one is Cherkez Ethem. The Cherkez Ethem were in a sense at the beginning of the War of Independence were acted very useful because he even helped to quell certain rebellions against the Grand National Assembly. But when he was asked to join the regular army under the command of an officer, he refused and he rebelled against the Grand National Assembly. And also the third type of the rebellions were the ones who were started with the as the national force of the minorities. The Armenians and the Greeks also rebelled, but at this point it's important to note that the Greek rebellions had took places where the Greek army, the invasion army of the Greeks, could not reach. But with their logistic and political support, that Greeks started to implement some types of banditries over the Turkish and the Muslim villages. So did the Armenians, but thanks to the regular army, which were not disbanded after the armistice of Mudros in the eastern Anatolia, that the Armenian rebellions were quelled easily. So after these four types of rebellions, it's useful to mention the consequences of these rebellions. First, and probably the most important consequence was it prolonged the organization of the regular army, and also it in a sense extended the date of victory. The War of Independence would be resulted with victory shorter if these rebellions did not occur. And also it facilitated the invasions in Anatolia because, as Article 7 of the Armistice of Mudros had stated, that if the security of the region was in jeopardy, the Allied powers has right to invade those territories. So they used these rebellions as an excuse to further their invasions. And also the rebellions had caused too many loss of manpower that the Muslim Turks has in a sense died in these rebellions, which also created a negative effect on the formation of the regular army and the number of ranks that can be accumulated within the regular army. Also, while dealing with these rebellions, the Grand National Assembly, whose finances were in dire situation, now got worse, because in order to finance the military actions against these rebellions, that the economic conditions got worsened. But there are also some positive consequences, that the quelling of these rebellions, the success of the Grand National Assembly had in a sense increased its charisma and helped it to insert its authority on the Anatolian regions more easily. So with the quelling of these rebellions, the formation of the regular army has also fastened, because now all the groups that opposes, all the militias who oppose the formation of the regular army were either quelled, or because the defeat of those local forces, that they had no choice but to join the regular army ranks. And also with the quelling of these rebellions, the limited authority or the charisma or the last spectacles of respect that can be observed among the public that supports the Anatolian movement, the charisma of the Caliph and the Sultan and its authority has been heavily damaged. And it got weaker as the gap that occurred were filled by the Grand National Assembly. And also it is understood that the rebellions can jeopardize the territorial and the political or the ideal integrity of the Anatolian movement. And it would be also useful to give some short and brief information about content or the extent of these rebellions. The most prominent ones, as mentioned before, was Kuvayi Inzibatiye. This, in a sense, had also assumed the name of the army of the Caliph. But this army has been founded against the national forces with the help of the British and with the graces of Ottoman Sultan, the last Sultan Mehmed VI, Mehmed Vahdettin. So, in fact, this army, the army of Caliphate, the Kuvayi Inzibatiye, it lasted for only almost 2 months. It was founded in April 1920, but dissolved or disbanded in June 1920. So for 2 months, they, in a sense, failed to create the desired effect. But this army were also used as a screen for the ones who wants to join the Anatolian movement. So this rebellion has, in a sense, has gained certain success in the Izmit region, which is close to Istanbul but far away from Ankara. But after Izmit, the organization or the command of the officers of this army were totally destroyed, and certain members had escaped from the ranks of this army of the Caliphate and joined the Anatolian movement. So the other rebellions that emerged in Bolu, Afyon, Yozgat or Konya, these are mostly had started with the personal ambitions of their leaders. The examples can also be more detailed because the other rebellions like Ali Batı Rebellion, Cemil Çeto Rebellion, Koçgir Rebellion, all these rebellions even affected the authority of the Turkish Grand National negatively, but as mentioned before, these rebellions, in a sense, the quelling of these rebellions, in a sense, helped to increase the authority of the Grand National Assembly. Now, the Greeks that we mentioned before had started their rebellions where the army of the Greece could not reach. And the most important one, the most crucial one, and this one almost lasted for 3 years. That the Greeks in the region of Trabzon, in the Black Sea region of today's Turkey, had rebelled in order to form the ancient Pontus Greek Empire, Pontus Greek state in the city of Trabzon. But the quelling could only be achieved in February 1923 after the final victory over the Greeks in the War of Independence after 30th of August 1922. And also the Cherkez Ethem that we mentioned were a very significant and an important incident because Cherkez Ethem also helped the quelling the rebellions that we mentioned before, especially in the Yozgat rebellion. He were in a sense promoted, he was shined by the Anatolian movement because of his successes in quelling these rebellions. But again, because of the personal ambitions or his dedication to, in a sense, assume the leadership of national struggle, Cherkez Ethem had rejected to join the regular army, and especially during the Inonu battle, in the first Inonu battle, he sided with the he didn't officially sided with the Greeks or allied with the Greeks, but during the first Inonu battle, he also attacked the regular army, and after the victory of first Inonu battle, the regular army targeted Cherkess Ethem and in a sense quelled his rebellion, and he sought refuge in the Greek forces. So in order to hamper any future rebellions, that Grand National Assembly, as mentioned before, had codified the law against treason, and the Grand National Assembly also founded the independence tribunals, which will be detailed in the next sessions. The official policy of the Istanbul government, as mentioned before, was to cope and give and conform with the demands of the British, especially the British, because the Istanbul government had believed that by gaining the support of the British, by complying with all their desires, that they could ease the conditions of the peace treaty that was planned to be signed with the Ottoman Empire. But in the Paris Peace Conferences, because the inability of the victorious powers to share the spoils of Ottoman Empire had in a sense extended the time of the peace treaty. As we remember that the Armistice of Mudros was signed in October 1918, but the peace treaty were signed almost 2 years later in August 1920. So the Istanbul government's actions until the Treaty of Sevres, which is the name of the peace treaty that was signed with the Ottoman Empire but did not came into power. Until the Treaty of Sevres, the Istanbul government had in a sense found some legitimacy among the Ottoman public because of their official political attitude that complying or coping with the victorious powers would facilitate the diplomatic efforts of the Istanbul government in the peace conference. But in August 1920, when the diplomatic mission of the Istanbul government, who was led by Damat Ferit Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier at the time and also brother-in-law of the Sultan, Mehmet Vahdettin, and the diplomatic mission were composed of people like Hadi Pasha, Rıza Tevfik, and Reşet Halis Bey, Reşet Halis Bey was the ambassador of Switzerland of the Ottoman Empire. Hadi Pasha were the Minister of National Education, and Rıza Tevfik Bey was a high-ranking state official. But all these people were in a sense were totally obedient to the personality of the Sultan. So as Sultan's political trend or Sultan's orders were considered as sacred orders, so they totally obeyed or preferred to obey the Sultan because of their personal interests. So the Sevres Treaty, in a sense, were a treaty that did not leave the Ottoman Empire a space to live. Now, according to this treaty, that the Ottoman Empire were diminished to a small Anatolian state. Because when we look at the articles of this treaty, because it had more than 400 articles, but the content of these articles were generally based on the sharing the Ottoman lands among the victorious powers of the First World War. So, according to Sevres Treaty, that the Straits, which became an international issue as mentioned in the 19th century in 1841 London Conference, now the Marmara region, which contains the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the Turkish Straits, were now to be governed by an international committee, by international commission. And the Eastern Thrace, all the lands including Edirne, including the cities of today's Edirne, Tekirdağ and Kırklareli were given to Greeks. Also in the Western Anatolia, the city of Izmir were also given to the Greeks. And in the southern parts of Turkey, in Antalya region, that created an Italian mandate, and on the Adana region, it created a French mandate, which in a sense had closed the Mediterranean coasts of the new Ottoman Empire that was designed or planned in the Treaty of Sevres. Only a small portion of Mediterranean coasts were remained in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, but also it was debatable. It's also questionable that that any profit that the Ottoman Empire might gain from this small port in the south of Konya would be again exploited by the victorious powers. So when we come to south, the Syria, which were already occupied by the French, now became under French mandate, so it's Iraq under the British mandate, and on the eastern Anatolia, a Greater Armenia was founded, and this Greater Armenia also included the cities like Erzurum and Trabzon, which Erzurum is a significant city for the War of Independence because the second important congress, the Congress of Erzurum, were held there. And also in the southeast Anatolia, that it was designed a Kurdish state with extended autonomy and with almost independence. So the Ottoman Empire has left with the inner Anatolia, and on the north some Black Sea ports were remained in the hands of the Ottoman Empire. So with this treaty, the Ottoman Empire had in a sense accepted that it was to become a semi-colonial state, because according to the article, even Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which was conquered and ruled as the capital of the Ottoman Empire for almost 500 years, now were given under the command of a unified international commission. But the problem with this treaty was that according to the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 Constitution, that any international agreements that were signed with other states should have to be ratified and approved by the Ottoman Parliament. But because after the invasion of Istanbul in March 1920, so in August 1920, when the Treaty of Sèvres were signed, that there was no legitimate organization who would ratify this treaty, and thus the treaty could not come into power. And so in order to jump this step, or in order to eliminate this step, the treaty could not reach to the Sultan with the approval of the Ottoman Parliament, but instead Sultanate Council were collected in order to discuss the terms of this treaty. Even though that most people, most Ottoman public, even the supporters of the Sultan had in a sense showed their objections to the treaty, because when you look at the map that was drawn according to Treaty of Sèvres, the Ottoman Empire were in a sense returned to its principality form of the early 14th century. And also the Grand National Assembly in Ankara had severely rejected this Treaty of Sèvres, and the conditions and the articles of Treaty of Sèvres has also proved that the policies of conforming or coping with the victorious powers of Istanbul is totally false and wrong. So this also, the Treaty of Sèvres had increased the legitimacy and acceptance of the Grand National Assembly, and in a sense made the Ottoman public, especially in Anatolia, that Grand National Assembly is the only institution that can take the Turkish nation to full independence. So the Treaty of Sèvres has also served the Grand National Assembly positively, because it was not ratified, even though the Council of Sultanate and the Sultan had approved the treaty. According to the Ottoman Constitution, the treaty could not came into force. So after the Treaty of Sèvres, the main goal of both the victorious powers and the Greek army had become to make the Grand National Assembly accept the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. Because when the Greek armies or the invading armies could reach Ankara, they could close down the Grand National Assembly, as they did to Ottoman Parliament in March 1920, and in a sense they can force the representatives or the parliamentaries to ratify and accept the Treaty of Sèvres. But as a final anecdote, it could be stated that the ones who signed and accepted the conditions of the Treaty of Sèvres were listed as the traitors of the homeland, and this list were also named the list of 150. These 150 people were banished from the Turkish state after the War of Independence has won, And also in 1927, they, by a decree that was promulgated, that their Turkish citizenship were lost. So the Treaty of Sèvres is accepted, is recognized as the document which shows the treason of the Istanbul government and the Sultan to the Turkish nation. Because again, when you look at the map, that the Treaty of Sèvres leaves no living space for the Ottomans, and all the fertile and the rich lands were taken or were either annexed or taken under the authority or under the influence of foreign powers. So the Sultan's acceptance to such an agreement also started to question the legitimacy or the competency of the Sultan. So from after the Treaty of Sèvres, it could also be observed that the personal critics against Mehmet Vahdettin became more visible, especially within the ranks of Grand National Assembly, and the Congress decisions that were taken in Erzurum and in Sivas and Amasya, which strongly stated that the Sultan and the Istanbul government can no longer perform their duties, and a national government should replace and administer the Turkish lands, while the Caliph Sultan were rescued from the pressure of the invading forces. But when the Treaty of Sèvres were signed, even though the idea of rescuing the Sultan and the position of the Caliph were present, but in a sense, the questions now started stem as if Vahdettin were the right person or the Sultan to follow. So the Treaty of Sèvres, again, as we mentioned, made the Grand National Assembly as a sole representative of the Turkish nation in Anatolia, and the support for the Grand National Assembly and also the failure of the Istanbul government's policies, which became evident when we look at the articles of the Sèvres. So the rebellions also lost their legitimacy, and Grand National Assembly has now assumed the role, and acceptance of his position as the sole representative of the Turkish nation were cemented. It was generally mentioned that the main aim of the Turkish Grand National Assembly and also the main aim of Mustafa Kemal was to form a regular army in order to fight against the invading forces, especially against the Greek army. So when the rebellions were quelled and when the Treaty of Sèvres were signed, this, as mentioned before, has facilitated the formation of the regular army. And also because that the rebellions and the Treaty of Sèvres has cemented the authority of Grand National Assembly, now the formation of the regular army became more available. So within the ranks of Grand National Assembly, Ministry of National Defense were also founded, and these ministries also started to assign commanders to the Anatolian regions. For instance, the first commander, Ali Fuat Pasha, was assigned as the commander of the Western Anatolian forces. But Ali Fuat Pasha were responsible of, in a sense, organizing the local national forces and, in a sense, giving them a characteristic of regular army, because it became evident that the local national forces cannot lead the War of Independence into victory, because the Greek armies had attacked major cities like Balıkesir, Bursa, Uşak, or Nazilli, and the national forces failed to stop the Greek advancement into these cities. So it became evident that the necessity for regular army, especially in the Western Front, is of crucial importance. So, because Ali Fuat Pasha's, in a sense, unsuccessful performance of his duty to create a regular army in the Western Anatolia, he was deassigned, and Colonel İsmet Bey, who will become İsmet İnönü, will assigned as the commander of the Western Anatolia. So when İsmet İnönü were assigned as the commander of Western Anatolia, some of the leaders of the national forces has refused to accept his commands. And the most important one was, as we mentioned before, Çerkez Ethem, who refused to join the regular army and rebelled against, in a sense, Ankara. İsmet İnönü became much more successful than Ali Fuat Pasha, and he, in a sense, succeeded to form a regular army in the Western Anatolia, which also proved its success after the first İnönü battle. This was the first serious battle that was done between the Ankara government and the Greek army. And in this battle, that the armies of the Grand National Assembly had defeated the Greeks, and thus, finally, it's proved that the only way to win or to defeat the Greek armies was through the formation of a regular army. So after the formation of the regular army and cementing the authority of the Grand National Assembly, the Treaty of Sèvres and the rebellions, that the War of Independence were waged in various fronts. Even though it's a fact that in certain fronts that there was no need for a regular army to be formed or reorganized because of the national forces, and the public and the population in the regions were so helpful, and in a sense the armed groups and the civilians had fought together in order to defeat the invading forces. Now first on the Eastern Front, as we mentioned before, Kazım Karabekir Pasha, who was the commander of the Eastern armies, had in a sense rejected to disband his army according to the Treaty of Armistice of Mudros. So in the Eastern Front there was an army which were not disabandoned and were still keeping its positions. So in the east, the Armenians had started to rebel, but as mentioned before, because the Russians were left out of the First World War in 1917, so the Armenians lost their major land support. Only there was a support of the Allied powers, of the victorious powers, but because of no land connection or geographical connection, the Armenians had to act by themselves. So in June 1920, 2 months prior to the Treaty of Sèvres, that Kazım Karabekir Pasha, the Eastern Army, had started to move against the Armenians in Eastern Anatolia, who were in open rebellion against the Grand National Assembly and the Anatolian movement, surprisingly with the support of Istanbul through British, and also that their national motivation since the First World War. Because there was also fear among the Armenians that the rage of the Eastern Army might turn on to Armenians because of their treason during the First World War and also their continuous attacks on the Turkish Muslims after the Armistice of Mudros. And also when Kazım Karabekir defeated the Armenians, that the Armenians and the Ankara government signed the Treaty of Gümrü on 3rd of December 1920. So with this treaty, that any hostilities between the Armenians and the Turks were ceased, and the eastern borders of Turkey was in a sense determined with this treaty. And the importance of this treaty was it was the first international treaty that in a sense the signatory party had recognized the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Also, it eliminated the articles of the Treaty of Sèvres regarding to Armenians. So the ineffectiveness of the Treaty of Sèvres now started to become more eminent, and with this agreement, Turkish Grand National Assembly had also showed to the world that no matter what the Treaty of Sèvres has tried to impose us, that Grand National Assembly will do its bidding. So with this treaty signed with the Armenians, that one of the main tenets of the Treaty of Sèvres regarding to the borders of Anatolia were totally eliminated. And this also helped that the regular armies in the Eastern Front to be transferred to the Western Front, where the real fight is going to occur against the Greeks. So on the south, in the southern front, it was the only front where the regular army was not needed, because as mentioned before, that the local resistance movements and the local national forces had, in a sense, united with the public, united with the civilians, and they fought against the French and the Armenians, especially in the cities of Marash, Urfa, and Adana. So with these successes, that another peace treaty was signed, not a peace treaty, but another treaty were signed with the French, the Ankara Agreement, and with this agreement, now the French totally abandoned their claims. Also, they physically left the south and southeastern parts of Turkey, of the Turkish state, and this, in a sense, became the second proof of the Grand National Assembly, showing the world that the Treaty of Sèvres is null. And with this treaty, every region in today, every southern borders of today's Turkey, except with the exception of the city of Hatay, were determined. And also the success of these local forces and the great sacrifices of the civilians, that these cities of Marash, Urfa, and Antep were granted with names like Şanlıurfa, the glorious Urfa, or Gaziantep, or Kahramanmaraş, Hero Maraş. These were became the official names of these cities. Now the Western Front is of the most crucial importance, because it is where the real war has been waged, and the Western Front was the determinant of the War of Independence. So in the Western Front, the Grand National Assembly and the regular army had fought against the armies of the Kingdom of Greece. Even though at the beginning that the national forces were the ones who put resistance to the Greek army, but due to the events that we mentioned before, that the regular army were founded, and now Greek armies and the Grand National armies started to wage war in the Western Front as two equal states. So in the Western Front, the first Turkish victory was the First Inoni battle, and this battle also forced the victorious powers to reconsider the Articles of Sèvres. So the Turkish victory over the Greek armies also allowed İsmet Pasha to promote it from colonel to general. So after this victory, the victorious powers had, in a sense, eased the terms of the articles of the Treaty of Sèvres, and they also wanted Grand National Assembly to accept or to ratify the Treaty of Sèvres. But even though the conference held in London between February 1921 and March 1921, that the Allied powers, again, the victorious powers again could not became successful in order to share the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, and also the Ankara government's political stance, which was drawn as a framework by the National Act, by the National Pact, could not be accepted by the victorious powers. But the importance of this London conference was that the victorious powers, especially the British, has also called representatives from the Ankara government, which can also be understood as an official recognition of the Grand National Assembly by the victorious powers. Also, another international recognition of the Turkish Grand National Assembly had came from the East. The Bolshevik government that was newly founded in Russia also, in a sense, approached to Ankara government because both of their motto of fighting against imperialism. As we know, after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a civil war within Russia, but by the 1921s, the Soviet Socialist republics were officially cemented its authority and, in a sense, defeated the White Army. So now, Grand National Assembly and the Ankara government and the Soviet Russia has, in a sense, described a common enemy, which also resulted with the rapprochement of these two forces. So Russia, in order to gain the favor of Turkish Grand National Assembly, and also with an intention that the new Turkish state that was to be on the verge of emerging might be influenced by socialism or communism. But again, at this point it's important to mention that the pragmatist character of the Grand National Assembly has in a sense motivated the Ankara government to work with Soviet Russia against the common enemy, but always kept the socialist and the communist ideas at bay, because there was no intention for either Mustafa Kemal or the supporters of the Anatolian movement to create a socialist state. So, as mentioned, in order to gain the favor of the Grand National Assembly, Russia, in a sense, became the first state that recognized the National Pact. So the Moscow Treaty that was signed on almost a year after the invasion of Istanbul in 16th of March 1921, that the Russians had signed a peace treaty with the Grand National Assembly. They said they no longer has the desires or the demands of the Tsarist Russia over the Turkish territories. So with the Gümrük, Ankara and Moscow treaties, now Turkish Grand National Assembly by March 1921 had secured its eastern and southern borders. Now all the efforts can now be focused on the western front. So the second battle that was done again with the Greeks was the Second İnönü battle, and in this battle that another Turkish victory over the Greek armies had in a sense created some disagreements among the victorious powers of the war of the First World War. So first the French in a sense had understood that without compromising or coping with the Grand National Assembly, not a clear solution can be received, because the French also understood the ineffectiveness of the Istanbul government and the Sultan. So after this victory of the Second İnönü, the Italians also started to abandon their positions in Muğla and Antalya, because they did not want to fight a war with the Grand National Assembly because of their internal political turmoils in the mainland Italy. So after the Second İnönü battle, the rapprochement with the French has started also, so this created a shattering among the unity of the victorious powers. So now Greece, and so now the British had remained the only force that supports the Kingdom of Greece and the Greeks' Anatolian invasion. And another war, the third war between the Greeks and the Turks, resulted with the victory of the Greek army this time, because these wars were waged in July 1921. These lasted for 2 weeks, and the Greek armies somehow managed to defeat the army of the regular army of the Grand National Assembly. So this, in a sense, the loss or the defeat of the army of the Grand National Assembly has now emerged the new questions that were ready to be asked, but cannot be asked because of the victories and the successes that the Grand National Assembly had received. So now after this defeat, the Turkish army withdrew to the east of Sakarya River, and also there were some questions emerged that instead of waging or continuing to war with the regular army, we should go back using the national forces again. But Mustafa Kemal's staunch defense of use of regular army, and also a law which was called the law of Başkomutanlık, the law of supreme commandship, supreme commander, which gave Mustafa Kemal all the authorities of the Grand National Assembly. And this also created an environment, also conditions for Mustafa Kemal to reorganize the logistics, the administration, the chain command, and the tactics of the army of the Grand National Assembly. So after the retreat of the Turkish army on the east of Sakarya River, naturally the Greek army followed, and the third war, the Sakarya War, has occurred in August and September 1921. And the time passed between these two wars, that new orders were released by the Grand National Assembly, but using that the orders of Mustafa Kemal were released that asked the public, that the civilians, to help the regular army, the army of the Grand National Assembly, with everything that they can sacrifice. So this also created a great movement of mobilization to support the regular army, and this also helped to achieve the defeat of Greeks at the Battle of Sakarya. So this Sakarya battle was a turning point in the War of Independence, also for the Turkish history, because the Sakarya River became the last defending war against the armies of the West since the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. So after this war, the Turks now started to attack in the Western Front, and Greeks now assumed the position of defense. Because of the military tactic of Mustafa Kemal, the Greeks could not proceed or could not march into Inner Anatolia anymore. And after this war, now the French and the Grand National Assembly now totally understood each other, and French, in a sense, forgave all its ambitions and interests in the Anatolia or in the regions that the Grand National Assembly has claims to have control of. So also after this victory, that it could be stated that British and the Greeks remained as the only forces to oppose the Grand National Assembly with Istanbul government. And also the French, the agreement with the French, which was signed on October 21 after the victory of Sakarya, that now the French has officially recognized the Grand National Assembly as the new Turkish state, and the territorial borders, with the exception of Hatay, had been drawn. And this also ended the warring status between French and the Turkish state, and French became the second state, but the first Western state who recognizes the National Pact, that any peace treaty that were to be signed with the Grand National Assembly should be based on the principles of National Pact. This was accepted by the French, which was accepted by the Russians for the first time. But now two European powers had accepted the National Pact as the official policy of the Turkish Grand National Assembly. So after the victory at Sakarya, there was a 1 year of stalemate during the War of Independence, in which both the Greek and the Turkish armies had prepared themselves. Now the Turkish army prepared itself for the final assault against the Greeks, against the invasion of the Greeks. So the assault had started on 26th of August 1922, and the surprise attacks and the various tactics which were to be explained, which can be observed on the map, that the Turkish armies has defeated the Greek army, and on the 9th of September, Turks have regained the armies of the Grand National Assembly have regained the control of Izmir, which officially ended the warring status of the War of Independence. And following this victory, that the Greeks' abandonment of Anatolia, the Greek armies abandoning Anatolia, created the conditions which would lead to Armistice of Mudros.